Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Crysler. Each episode, we talk to business leaders and subject matter experts to learn about the challenges they've overcome and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business. Hey, everybody, and thanks for joining me on another solo episode of the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I was on a call last month where a leader was listing out like 6 critical problems and did it in like 2 minutes or less. And of course, he was thinking like everything's critical, everything has to be fixed like yesterday. And so I wanted to talk about, what's actually happening underneath that, because I know there's a lot of folks that certainly feel that way. And there's a variety of reasons. Like there's a lot of, famous quotes around this idea: when everything's, a priority, nothing's a priority, right? But what's underneath all of that, kind of posturing, if you will, right, is just this general idea that we haven't created clarity. And so what we end up doing is kind of chasing all of the things, chasing, in a lot of cases, all of the symptoms, versus slowing down, understanding what the true root cause of things are, and prioritizing those based on, resources, based on value to the customer, internal constraints, right? There's a variety of lenses that you can start to measure this stuff by, but that's ultimately what's happening when you're feeling this constant, kind of firefighting motion, and kind of thinking like we have 15 different problems and we got to solve all of them. So ultimately, as you start to look at those different problems, you start to solve or try to solve them, with solutions that are honestly a lot of symptom-based things. Oftentimes, as you start to dig deeper and understand the actual root cause of things, you'll see, relationally, these problems be connected. So had we, again, just gotten some more clarity around what's happening, like where we're trying to go, because that is an element of this, and then really slow down from a pure kind of root cause perspective, we can often get a lot further faster. So typically I'd say there's, kind of 3, patterns, 3 things that I see, time and time again when folks don't have a, clear methodology to follow. And that's not to say, follow my methodology, right? I'm just saying whatever methodology you think is effective for you, if you don't have one, right, that's probably, the first problem, right? So kind of the 3 traps I tend to see, one, kind of chasing the loudest fire, right? And that could be, a particular customer or client situation that is unfolded. I think we've all been there. And, depending on the size organization, depending on the severity of it, that loud customer or client could pull a lot of resources in to try to satisfy it. And ultimately, you may kind of quell that fire, right? You may deal with the immediacy of it. But again, oftentimes, we don't unpack the actual root cause. We don't then proactively test whatever corrective and preventative measures we have rolled out. And therefore, it's just a matter of time before that same exact scenario unfolds again. Now, hopefully, it's not with the same customer or client. I've been there. And, it is a different customer or client that you're dealing with. But, it doesn't really matter specifically who, right, in terms of the impact, customer or client. It's just this general idea that we kind of run from the loudest problem to the next loudest problem. So Trap number two, we kind of, this was the opening of this, but, trying to do everything at once, right? So it's when everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. We can't have six different initiatives going at the same time. It sounds so doable, right? When you're sitting in a leadership meeting and you're laying out quarterly objectives, hey, we can knock these out and then we could get right into this. And the reality is that we, more times than not, could solve many more of our problems and move much, much faster if we just took a beat, right? Like just took a breath, took a pause. And a lot of times when people hear that, it's like, oh, then, we're shifting right into, paralysis and, analysis paralysis. And I didn't say that, right? Like, that's the crazy part, okay? I didn't say that. I didn't say, plan forever. I didn't say plan every scenario, right? There is real value in going through the motion, in experimenting. But that is within reason, right? There's a balance, like all things. There's a balance to be struck of what specific objectives are we working towards and how do we prioritize them so we're not, leaving an inefficient amount or insufficient amount of bandwidth for our people, right? Because at the end of the day, we all have the same amount of time. And so we have to be very intentional with the things that we're ultimately trying to work towards. So the third one, and again, I already mentioned this a little bit, but it's just the general idea that oftentimes we're solving for symptoms and we are not digging down deep enough to understand what the root cause is. So instead of understanding why maybe orders are being delayed, that could be for a variety of reasons, we throw some overtime at it. And we hope that solves the problem for today. And in some cases, it certainly will, right? But without understanding what's underneath that, why are we constantly having to do it? And P.S., it's not because, the team is inefficient, right? Generally speaking, okay? There's something that's driving that. And for a lot of, our clients, has nothing to do with the people, right? Has everything to do with the system, So again, those are, I would say, kind of the three biggest traps that I actually start to, or that I tend to see when folks are kind of feeling this, constant, fight or flight, type of response. So, where do we start, right? Like that's kind of generally the next question is like, well, where do we start then? What do I actually do to be able to, move away from this kind of cycle that we are constantly kind of running across? And for me, again, this is going to be dependent on, where are we going? What are we trying to do? What, kind of problems am I observing through, through conversation and the like. But generally speaking, it's good to start with, kind of like wherever we're at, right? So I'll say that, but the more tactical way to say this is, what are the things that we're currently measuring, or what are things that we can measure manually to get a better understanding of, what the current state is and ultimately what we're trying to do, right? So again, if let's say we're dealing with a lot of, upset customers because shipments are delayed and we're trying to throw overtime to get those shipments out, right? Understanding, one, are we measuring our on-time, delivery percentage? If we are, let's start there, right? Like where are we at today? How, far away from, let's say, target are we, right? Are we running at 70% or are we running at, 98%? And that 2% happen to impact, some, critical customer, right? Like, so everything becomes a fire when we don't have any way to contextualize the scenario. So we get everybody riled up, and it's kind of like the tornado, right? Like the tornado happens and then the tornado's gone and everything goes back to calm, right? So it's that same type of thought process. So where I like to start is kind of like, what are we already measuring? Or, what are some things that we could, measure manually or quickly to kind of get more context, more data points around the specific thing? Then we can start to get a little bit deeper in terms of actual root cause work to make sure that we are understanding what's underneath all of the different, kind of, I keep calling them symptoms, right? But like all of the different symptoms that we're kind of seeing from a day-to-day perspective. So an extension of this, right? And this kind of shows up in a variety of ways, but I've talked about it before, is again, kind of understanding like what's connected, right? So we really need to get an understanding back to the symptoms, back to the things we're measuring, all of the direct and indirect touch points or connections that are made. And the thing I love to do for this is around process flow mapping, right? Some people will say, we need a value stream map. And sure, I can make the argument for that depending on, like what some specific problems are and kind of what, where we're trying to go, right? Like what's the intentionality of the thing. But more times than not, I would say when we're trying to understand touch points, connections, direct and indirect, my default's process flow map. Right? Because that gives me a high level and we can then zoom in to understand, at a more detailed level, what individual maybe process flows are, kind of all of that. So it gives me a really good visualization of what's happening. And again, more importantly, like how things are related. So again, that gets us zoomed up a little bit. Instead of being in the weeds and dealing with that specific fire, lets us zoom out, lets us understand how all of these things are actually related. Is one of my favorite, I've told this story before, but it's one of my favorite methods of, solving for intermittent problems. Because oftentimes it's very difficult to visualize, especially in larger organizations, all of the touch points that, a particular product has to go through from start to finish. And so mapping it out gives us that visualization, helps us to start to understand where do we need to start, bringing folks into the conversation, right, at a detailed perspective, and where do we start poking? What data do we have? Like, how do we get more data? Where, can we do something, again, more manual to collect some of those different data points? And the other thing that I would tell people is, after we kind of start going through these specific things, right? Pick one, right? Pick an actual priority. Again, I like to use the measurement of, through the lens of the customer, right? Like how are they measuring value? Because for the majority of the problems that we're trying to solve for in really any organization, if it's not increasing the perception of value for your customers or clients, what's the point, right? You can argue some internal effectiveness or efficiencies that ultimately drive some financial outcomes. But ultimately, if we're driving towards some level of kind of growth, it's going to be, external, right? And so thinking through it from the lens of the customer, what makes things easier for them? What do they perceive to be less friction? What do they perceive to be more valuable in terms of, an end-to-end flow? That's the starting point, right? But no matter what that is, no matter what the kind of problems are that are up on the board, no matter what the number of priorities are, you got to start with one. People will try to push back and say, what about 2? What about 3? It's like, well, why not 30? So I can go to the extremes just like anybody. Start with 1. Okay, let's see where we get. Let's make sure we really understand it. And let's look for a thing that's going to really move the needle, for us, right? And again, all of this is stuff that I didn't just wake up and learn, right? Like this is all lessons that came through lots and lots of years of screwing it up. So that's life earned lessons that I'm sharing with you here. Some of the other things that kind of come up around this, I touched on it a little bit, but I have companies that'll ask me like, "Hey, we're not measuring a lot of kind of operational things. Like we don't have a lot of good data, or we do have some data, but we're not really sure how kind of accurate or good it is. So it's like, what should we do, right?" And simply said, right, like you probably have more data than you think. It's just about, again, getting back to connecting those dots. And man, like I've done a lot of things where I've needed to get a better visualization on something. So I'll literally use a yellow legal pad or white legal pad, and I'll do tally marks for things. And you could use it for a variety of data collection activities, right? Like I was working with a client who, I was asking about their product quality, and they said, well, we don't really measure that. I said, okay, fair enough. I said, well, do you think that it happens regularly? I don't know, probably, I mean, like, yeah, we definitely have some issues and, definitely some things that probably repeat. It's like, well, how about for the next 30 days, you grab a legal pad and you grab the team and you say, anytime you run into this issue, put a tick mark on here. And that way we'll review at the end of 30 days and we'll see, right, if this is a big enough problem to dive deeper, right? Maybe we need to extend it to 60 days or 90 days, right? We're measuring this stuff for 90 days and we got 4 tick marks, probably not real high on the priority list, right? Probably some other opportunities. And again, back to the lots of this stuff ends up being related. Maybe we need to look at another related area that will give us sufficient information to be able to action, right? And again, the whole idea is, data is amazing, right? Getting to the root cause is, amazing, right? But the whole point of any of these types of activities is to be able to action them, right? You action them so you're actually moving the needle, delivering more value. You are, increasing the effectiveness internally, thereby impacting your financials, right? Thereby creating infrastructure to build, towards sustainable growth and operational excellence, right? All of those things are why we're doing the things that we're doing, right? So, as we kind of get ready to wind down this episode, a couple of things for anybody new here. The newsletter, or the podcast, the solo episodes are an extension of our free weekly newsletter, Business System Saturday. So I'd encourage you to check that out. Free to subscribe, free to unsubscribe if you're not getting any value out of that. And the other thing, kind of lastly, is the one thing that that I would leave for people in terms of what's the one idea. The one idea is that all of this stuff is simple, not easy, right? It comes through experience, experimenting, practicing. Sure, there's some shortcuts, if you will, by having conversations with folks like me that have done this previously, that have seen these types of problems, who admittedly, I just put a post out today about this, but have admittedly spent years solving for symptoms and not unpacking true root cause. That's the takeaway, right? Like you can learn all of this stuff just like I did, trial and error through, learning and reading and experimenting. And there's also something to be said for, shortcutting and getting some outside perspective on the things that you're dealing with, right? It's very possible to shift from this reactive firefighting, everything's a priority, to understanding how to move the needle further faster by taking a beat, understanding the things that are connected, diving deep to make sure we're at the root cause level and not just, throwing some tools at symptoms, systemizing and optimizing those systems, looking for opportunities to continue to support our people and process through, tools and enablement. And that's all the stuff, right? So again, thanks so much for tuning into this episode. Appreciate you doing that, and I'll catch you on the next episode.
Thank you so much for listening today. If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Crysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Crysler.